one way to characterize information or to qualify information is information as disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. And let's see what the difference is. Disinformation is intentionally false information. It's giving out information that we know it is false, and many people do that. Then we have misinformation, and this is also that I guess we are all guilty of, because we may communicate information that is false information, but we don't do it on purpose. So it's unintentionally false information. And the third type of information is propaganda, and that is the use of information with the purpose of changing attitude and or public opinion. And of course, many governments, many political parties use propaganda to change public opinion or to drive public opinion. So this is one way to see types of information that we see in our environment. Okay, disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. Now, another way to understand the source of information is also to think about information sources as primary sources, secondary sources, popular sources, and scholarly peer review sources. Okay, so let's explore what do we mean by primary, secondary, popular, scholarly. And people, some authors also talk about tertiary information sources. What is a primary source? Well, a primary source provides first-hand testimony or direct evidence concerning a topic under investigation. They are created by witnesses or recorders who experience the events or condition being documented. So it's a first-hand testimony. Often these sources are created at the time when the events or conditions are occurring. But primary sources can also include, and this is very important for us, because this is part of our record, of our information record, in autobiographies, memoirs, oral histories that are recorded later. Primary sources are characterized by their content, regardless of whether they are available in original format, in microfilm, microfiche, in digital format, or in published format. So a primary source, of course, is a first-hand account. Somebody who witnessed something happening, or it was part of something happening. Okay, so that's a definition of what a primary source is. By the way, a primary source does not mean that it's an objective source. It may or it is subjective. In my opinion, and this is my personal opinion, objectivity is very hard to achieve. Mostly is subjectivity what we see, because we are human beings with emotions, with experiences, with education, with principles, with ethics, with moral, and all of that and many more things shape how we see the world. So if there are two witnesses in that watch an event, and if you interview them, they probably will give you different accounts of what happened. Why? Because it's a subjective opinion. So again, what I was trying to say is that a primary source does not mean objectivity. Okay, in most cases means subjectivity. However, for any event, news or historical event, primary sources are of the most importance. There's no other way. And if you do research, for example, in history, you want to research primary sources. Okay? Or if you do research in communications, etc., etc. Now, what are secondary sources? Secondary sources are less easily defined than primary sources. So here we have the first difference. Generally, they are accounts written after the fact with the benefit of hindsight. They are interpretations and evaluations of primary sources. Secondary sources are not evidence, but rather commentary on and discussion of evidence. However, what some define as secondary sources, others define as tertiary sources. Context is everything. And what they mean is, depending on the domain in the discipline, it may be considered a secondary source or a tertiary source. Okay? And that's what I put here, this note. The definition of secondary source or tertiary may vary depending upon the discipline, the context, and or the domain. Okay? Some examples of secondary sources are bibliographies, bibliographical work, commentary, criticism, dictionaries, and bibliographies too. Normally, in some domains or disciplines, bibliographies and dictionaries are considered tertiary sources. History, journal articles, and that may be considered a primary source if in that journal article we have gathered original data. And if we have gathered original data in some disciplines, it might be considered a primary source. Magazines, newspapers, monographs, textbooks. Textbooks are also considered sometimes tertiary sources. Okay, and websites that are also considered primary, but they may have a lot of secondary and even tertiary source. If we think about the reference collection, I think we can characterize or qualify the reference collection as a tertiary source. Again, this is my opinion. And tertiary sources consist of information which is a distillation and collection of primary and secondary sources. And that's what I was just mentioning. And when we talk about almanacs, bibliographies, chronologies, dictionaries, encyclopedias, directories, fact books, guidebooks, indexes, abstracts, bibliography, etc., 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 manual and textbooks, we're talking about the reference collection. And they are considered by many, including myself, as a tertiary information source. Okay? Now let's give some context to this so we can see how it depends on the discipline or the domain, what we consider primary, secondary, or tertiary. For example, in the discipline of art and architecture, a primary source is a painting by Manet. Manet is a very well-known impressionist painter, or was a very well-known impressionist painter. A secondary source is considered an article critiquing the painting done by Manet. And a tertiary source would be a database where we have the bibliographic information of that article. That's just an example. In chemistry and life science, Einstein diary or autobiography would be considered a primary source. A monograph or a biography on Einstein's would be considered a secondary source. And a dictionary or an encyclopedia on physics is considered a tertiary source. Another example, in engineering or physical science, a patent would be a primary source. A secondary source would be a database, and a tertiary source would be a manual on using one invention. In humanities, we have letters written by Dr. Martin Luther King. That would be a primary source. A secondary source would be a website that comments or critiques Dr. King's writings. And a tertiary source would be an encyclopedia on civil rights movement. In the social science, a notes taken by a clinical psychologist is considered a primary source. When we are doing research and we collect primary data, we collect data out in the field, not data that is published in a data set or data that is in our literature review, but primary data. We go and do an experiment, or we observe, or we do a survey, that it is considered a primary source. A magazine or a journal article is considered a secondary source. But if it has data that was gathered by the scientists, it may be considered also a primary source. Okay? Original data. Remember, we have to make a distinction when we talk about research. We may think that research is when we do bibliographic research, and that is one type of research. But what I'm trying to talk about is original research. When you do an experiment, when you do a survey, when you do an interview, you are collecting original data. That's a primary source. A textbook is considered in the social science a tertiary source. And then performing arts. A movie, it's a primary source. A secondary source is a biography, for example, of the director. And a tertiary source is a guide to the movie. Okay? So again, and this is I think it's very important for us, in the reference collection, I think we mostly use tertiary sources. We don't use primary sources. Okay? We use secondary and mostly tertiary sources when we are manipulating the reference collection. It may be an electronic reference collection, or it may be a printed reference collection, and we're going to see some examples. I'm not going to get into every reference source because we know them. There are encyclopedias, dictionaries, fact books, directories, guidebooks, index, manuals, etc. So, I consider most of reference resources either secondary, and mostly tertiary sources. Okay. Okay, and here is something that is very important and relevant for us as librarians. And that's, how do we assess or how do we evaluate good information? Well, we have to think about at least 7 criteria, 7 elements of criteria. And by the way, this criteria also works for electronic and printed materials. One is the scope, okay, the extent or the range of that information. Then there is the audience, okay. Then there is currency, and that means if it's up to date or not. Then a specificity, okay. Then what is the focus? Then the level of a scholarship, and of course level of a scholarship and audience are directly related. And also is the format, how is the information presented. Here we have 2 tables, and I have added other elements of criteria. We already talked about format, if it's electronic or printed. We talk about scope, that's the purpose, the coverage, and the currency. We talk about the relation to other works. Is it unique? It's a new edition, it's a new version, it's an old version. And this, to me, is the most important. Okay? And that's authority. and that is important in printed and electronic information sources. Who is the author? Who is the publisher? Who sponsors the publication? Okay. When we do our work as reference librarian, we must look into authority. It may be electronic, it may be printed, but there is an author. And an author does not mean that it has to be a person. It may be a corporation. It may be a university. It may be a agency. Okay, so please do not limit yourself in thinking that authorship means one person or two person or three people. No, it means that, but it also may mean an agency, a corporation, a university, a lab, etc. Then, and this is the most, in my opinion, again, we have to guide ourselves by authority because it is the most objective measure. Okay? Then we have treatment and has to do with accuracy, objectivity, style, and audience. Objectivity is very hard to measure, especially when we are doing reference, and we will have to if we are a generalist and we work in a public or in an academic library and we're doing reference. There may be disciplines or domains that we are, and there will be for sure disciplines and domains in which we are not experts, okay? Because we cannot know it all. It is impossible in today's world to have somebody who can know everything. No, that may be in the past when knowledge was more limited. But today, it is impossible to find anybody who can know everything about every discipline. So, how do we measure accuracy and objectivity in a field in which we are fairly familiar? Well, it becomes impossible. So we have to go back to authority. And we always can say, well, this report was published by such and such. Therefore, in my criteria as a professional librarian, I think it's a report worth exploring because it was published or sponsored by such and such. Okay? And this is something that we must do as librarians. Arrangement, this is very important, how the resource is arranged. And of course, price and listing conditions, licensing conditions, I'm sorry. And here are some guidelines to evaluate electronic information or websites from the World Wide Web. Affiliation, again, affiliation is very important because it depends what institution is supporting the website. Audience, and this we have to be very careful when we are librarians because we have to match the information source with the audience. Okay? And that does by the way, this is not limited only to websites. This is for every type of information source or resource. We have to match the audience with the resource. Authority, again, is very important. I just mentioned why. Content, if how that website is organized. Currency is very important in some disciplines. Okay, when we are doing science, natural science or social science, we want current information. Okay, when we're doing other type of research, we may like to have probably older information. But in general reference question, when somebody comes at you and asks you about a map, just probably that person is looking for a current map. With the roads, it's looking for something for a current map with current roads, unless that person is doing historical research. Okay? If that person comes to you and asks you for a travel guide, that person is planning to travel and probably wants a current travel guide, unless is doing historical research. Okay, then there is design and objectivity. Again, objectivity is hard to measure. So in my case, as a reference librarian, as I was a reference librarian, I always go for authority and audience and affiliation. And again, this is not only for websites or web content, but it is also true uh, for printed sources. Another thing that we have to be aware is what we call peer review journal, and I think I mentioned that before, and let me explain it here. Okay, when we talk about scholarly or peer review journals, what it means is, and sometimes when you are in this program or in the future, you will be asked to do, for example, a research or a lit review on a topic, and you will be asked for, please make sure that your sources, that the sources that you are citing come from peer review journals. And what that means is that in order to get published in a peer review journal, the submission has to be reviewed by peers that before your manuscript or your paper can be published. And in most of cases, when I submit a paper or a manuscript to be published, it will be read by 2 or 3 other people in my field, and they will make observations. And in order for me to get my paper published, I will have to do the changes, or at least I will have to explain why I did what I did before I can get published. Of course, this is not a foolproof system, but there is not a better system yet. Okay? So when we publish in the social and in the science, in the social and natural science, we try to publish in scholarly peer review journals. And the advantage is that that publication has gone through a process of review. And secondly, what we use mostly in the social science and in the natural science are journal articles. We don't use books mostly to cite. Books are used to study at the university, but they are not mostly cite on research papers. Why? Because you want the most current information. And secondly, you want information that has been peer reviewed. And books are not peer review. Peer review articles are those who are published in peer review journals. I hope that it's clear. So that's a good source of information. Why? Because again, it's current, and secondly, the information that is published in peer review journals has been peer reviewed. Okay. Okay, let's talk, and this is a quick review of the reference source. I'm not going to go into detail because today we use mostly electronic sources of reference. However, it is important that you familiarize yourself with especially if you're a young person, with printed resources of reference. Okay, a definition. of a reference source, and this is very important, any publication from which authoritative information can be obtained, included but not limited to reference books, catalog records, printed indexes, and abstracting services and bibliographic databases. That's a very broad definition of reference sources. Reference sources provide background information, fact or specific details on a subject, and in my opinion, this is very important, point to other sources of information. So many times when we're doing reference, we start from a reference source, and then from there the reference source will point to other sources of information. Okay, and that's very important. Definition of reference source: designed to be consulted rather than for reading. And what that means is that, for example, if you have a dictionary, you use the dictionary to consult. You're not going to read the dictionary sequentially from the first page to the last page. You may do that, but in generally, what you're going to do is you're going to consult that dictionary, and it's not for reading sequentially. It will have facts and figures. It will have concise information to frequently asked questions, contain valuable information for particular subject areas, guides to information, and this is very important. If it's a printed material, do not circulate but remain in the library. So in the case of printed reference sources, they stay at the library. They don't go out in circulation. Using reference sources. Okay? Highlight specific aspects of a topic. And we have two examples here: an encyclopedia or a dictionary. And there are biographical dictionaries, for example. Provide reference to information already gathered, and that's a subject bibliography. Okay? That's a tertiary source, by the way. A subject bibliography is a tertiary source. An encyclopedia is a tertiary source. A dictionary is a tertiary source. And we have also statistics and facts, and we have almanacs and or yearbooks. Okay, we have types of reference sources. We have direct. It is not necessary to consult another source. These are terminal sources. That what it means is that when you go to a dictionary, and you may stop your consultation there. Of course, if it addresses the information needs of your patron. And those terminal sources are, all of them are tertiary, by the way, but terminal sources are dictionaries, encyclopedias, and manuals. But in the second case, we call it indirect, because they guide you to other sources. Okay? And those indirect reference sources are abstracts, bibliographies, concordances, and indexes. And these are some examples. Where do we find reference sources? Well, usually in a library there's going to be a reference collection. And we can go there and see the reference resources that we have in our reference collection. But you can search the library catalog. You can browse the reference shelf. That's what I was talking about. There may be a guide on how to use reference books. Use an online guide to web reference sources, or you may ask the reference librarian. I always recommend that when you visit the library, go and talk to the reference librarian. And you may want to become a reference librarian. If you want to become a reference librarian, you have to make sure that you are very proficient using the reference collection in printed format and in electronic format. Okay? Some examples of reference sources. And again, this is especially for the younger generation. Well, we have almanac, yearbook, atlas, gazetteer, guidebook, bibliography, concordance, directory, encyclopedia, handbook, manual. We have dictionaries, unabridged. We have full size, average, as a shortened version. We have historical, we have specialized, we have subject, we have foreign language, we have a biographical dictionary, etc., etc. These are the classical examples of reference sources. But there are others like databases, like indexes, etc. Okay? And of course, I'm going to show some pictures of these examples of printed reference sources. But we find the same information nowadays in electronic format. Okay, here we have an almanac, we have a yearbook, we have a coder's handbook. So here we have three examples with three figures of reference sources. Of course, these are printed, but the information that is there may be, or it will be found also in electronic format. And here are the definitions. I'm not going to read this. You please make sure you read them and understand the difference between an almanac and a yearbook and a handbook. Here we have biographical sources. And these are, by the way, these are tertiary all the way, because these, for example, this is an index. This is a woman in world history. This is a biography encyclopedia. And this is a web page on biographies. And here is a definition of biographical sources. We have the atlas, and these are atlases and maps are the main source of geographical information in libraries. Many encyclopedias and dictionaries have maps, but these are more specialized. We have a gazetteer, and when you use it, and here's the definition: when it's used in a geographical sense, it's a geographical index or dictionary. Okay. This is very important if you want to travel. It's a guidebook or a travel book. And again, if you have that in your reference collection, you have to make sure that it's current. Okay? Because you don't want to send anybody on a trip with all information. Okay? And probably gets there, and if he uses the guide that you provide, it has information. That person won't be able to know exactly how much it's the fare to get it into a museum or to ride a train or etc., etc. So it has to be current. Encyclopedias have to be current. Because imagine historical encyclopedias or in political science when what is happening in Syria or what happened in Libya, okay? And if your encyclopedia is 5 or 6 years old, well, those, and it's a printed version, those historical events will not appear there. What about the Pope and the Pope who quit his job? Well, that won't appear in a encyclopedia that is more than 2 or 3 years old. You know, the Pope resigned. Well, I think that's only has happened 1 or twice in the history of the Catholic Church. So you will not find that in the encyclopedia if it's not current. So the reference collection have to be current. A bibliography, and this is very important because it's a systematic list of written works by an author or by a subject. Okay? Bibliographies are very, very important. Concordance. It's an alphabetic arranged index of principal words or selected words in a text. The Bible, it's very there are many concordances that with words that are part of the Bible, for example, and also of major writers such as Chaucer, Shakespeare, and others. Directory, it's very important. And there are directories of library science associations, library science school, etc. But there are many other directories. Okay, so if you want to, you want to keep in your reference collection a good collection of directories. Of course, again, these are, and I'm showing you pictures for the younger generation. These are printed versions, but of course you can find these in electronic version. The encyclopedia, and here we have a picture of the Britannic Encyclopedia that is not anymore, because unfortunately the traditionally printed Encyclopedia Britannica is not being published anymore. So now they have gone all the way electronic. So here you have a picture of an old encyclopedia. There are also a specialized encyclopedia like this one on social science research methods. Here, you have some information on encyclopedias. Of course, they are all now online. And you will have to pay, or the library will have to pay access if you want to have access to the full version of the encyclopedia. You have to pay a license. But the great thing about being online is that you will have the most current information. Okay, manuals, for example, there are especially well known are car manuals, but there are many types of manuals. Dictionaries, and we have here different types of dictionaries. Some are like general dictionaries, some are language dictionaries, or discipline based dictionaries such as Black's Law Dictionary. Okay, so we have done an overview of what the reference sources are. But the most important thing about this lecture is, if we go back, is assessing and evaluating reference sources. Okay, so we have to make sure that when we provide a service as a reference librarian, we provide the best service possible. And one way to do that is to assess and to assess and to teach our patron how to assess and evaluate information sources. Okay, so these are some of the criteria used to evaluate information sources. Okay, thank you so much.